In the grand, often tragic sweep of American history, few moments are as starkly defined as the afternoon of Friday, November 22, 1963. The motorcade in Dallas, the bright Texas sun, the sudden crack of rifle fire. It is a scene seared into the national consciousness. But history is not an immutable text. It is a story of countless crossroads and contingent moments. Let us propose a single, pivotal alteration to that day's events. The final, fatal shot misses its mark. President John F. Kennedy, though wounded, survives. He recovers. The world, holding its breath, exhales in a collective sigh of relief and profound shock. This singular change does not simply extend a life. It sets in motion a cascade of consequences, a butterfly domino effect where one small deviation creates an entirely new timeline. What follows is an exploration of that alternate 1960s, a decade that might have been. It is not an exercise in certainty. Rather, it is an inquiry into the power of individual leadership. By tracing the ripple effects through the defining struggles of the era, the escalating conflict in Vietnam, the perilous standoff of the Cold War, the righteous demand for civil rights at home, we can imagine a landscape both familiar and fundamentally different. This is the 1960s you never saw. The very nature of a presidency is negotiation between intention and external pressure. A president's character, temperament, fears, and courage become instruments of statecraft. For a man who had faced the Cuban Missile Crisis, a confrontation with mortality in Dallas would be a crucible. It would forge a different Kennedy, perhaps more cautious, perhaps more resolute, but undeniably changed. We begin with the immediate aftermath, recovery and reflection where the first dominoes fall. The shock would be a personal trial and a national trauma. Relief would create political capital. Goodwill and unity born from crisis. How a recovering president spends that capital, bold initiatives or cautious consolidation, is the first critical question. Those first months set the stage for the reimagined decade. The news from Parkland Memorial Hospital would have spread not with the finality of a death knell, but with the tense, uncertain rhythm of a medical bulletin. The president is alive. He is in surgery. He is in critical condition. For hours, then days, the nation would be united in a singular, anxious vigil. The prayers in churches, the somber faces gathered around television sets, the hushed tones of news anchors, all would contribute to a national atmosphere of immense gravity. The successful but arduous recovery of the president would be perceived as nothing short of a miracle, a reprieve from a darkness that had come perilously close. This collective experience of near catastrophe, followed by profound relief, would create a powerful, if temporary, bond between the leader and the led. Upon his return to the White House, likely weeks later, Kennedy would have been a visibly altered figure. The physical scars would be a constant, public reminder of the fragility of life, but the deeper changes would be psychological. A man already keenly aware of his place in history would now be imbued with a sense of borrowed time. His initial public appearances would be carefully managed, his speeches likely focused on themes of gratitude, unity, the need for a less vitriolic public discourse. The investigation into the assassination attempt would proceed with an intensity far exceeding the Warren Commission, as a living president and a Justice Department led by his own brother would demand a thorough and unimpeachable accounting. The quest for truth would not be a historical inquiry, but an urgent matter of national security, shaping public trust and political paranoia for years. The political calculus in Washington would be immediately scrambled. The visceral shock of the attack would likely silence, for a time, the most strident partisan criticism. Opponents who had decried his policies would find it difficult to immediately resume their attacks against a man who had so recently been a target of political violence. This period of quiet would provide Kennedy with a unique window of opportunity, a moment when the normal rules of political engagement were suspended. A brush with death does not leave a person unchanged, and a president of the United States is no exception. John F. Kennedy, a man who had cultivated an image of youthful vigor and cool detachment, would emerge from the crucible of survival with a profoundly altered perspective. The experience would likely temper his appetite for high-stakes geopolitical gambles. Having looked into the abyss on a personal level, he would be even more reluctant to lead his country to the brink of a similar precipice. The lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the value of back-channel communication, the importance of giving an adversary a way out, would be reinforced with the weight of personal trauma. This newfound caution would not be a sign of weakness, but of a mature wisdom forged in the fires of an intensely personal crisis. His domestic priorities would also sharpen into a finer focus. A leader who has been granted more time on Earth may feel a more urgent need to build a lasting legacy, one measured not in political victories, but in tangible improvements to human lives. The abstract concepts of justice, equality, opportunity, Kennedy might see the fight for civil rights, for instance, less as a political problem to be managed and more as a moral imperative to be championed. The patience he had previously shown in the face of Southern resistance might wear thin, replaced by a conviction that some injustices were too great to be tolerated any longer. His own vulnerability could foster a deeper empathy for the vulnerable in his own country. This transformation would inevitably manifest in his leadership style. By late 1963, Vietnam was a growing problem, but it was not yet America's war. The United States had over 16,000 military advisors on the ground. The situation in Saigon was deteriorating following the coup against Ngo Dinh Diem. In our history, President Johnson, fearing he'd be seen as the man who lost Vietnam, dramatically escalated U.S. involvement. That escalation led to a massive ground war. A surviving Kennedy, however, would have faced a different set of political and personal pressures. Haunted by the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and chastened by the close call of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was already deeply skeptical of large-scale military intervention. His survival in Dallas would have only solidified this instinct toward caution, making him far less likely to commit hundreds of thousands of American troops to a jungle war halfway around the world. Instead of escalation, Kennedy's approach in 1964 and 1965 would likely have been one of managed disengagement, a strategic retreat disguised as a political solution. He had already expressed private doubts about the war's winnability, famously telling an aide, "It's their war." He would likely have pursued Vietnamization a decade early, pressuring the South Vietnamese government to reform itself and take primary responsibility for its own defense, while simultaneously seeking a negotiated political settlement. This would not have been an easy path. It would have drawn fierce criticism from military hardliners and from conservatives who would accuse him of appeasement. But a president who had faced down an assassin's bullet would possess the political fortitude and moral authority to withstand such attacks. The butterfly, domino, effect here is profound. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was, a sobering education for both John F. Kennedy and his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev. Both leaders had stared into the nuclear abyss and recoiled, understanding that their ideological competition must be managed to prevent global catastrophe. A Kennedy who survived Dallas would have carried this lesson, now amplified by his own personal confrontation with mortality, into his second term. His foreign policy would likely have pivoted more decisively toward what would later be called détente, a policy of reducing tensions with the Soviet Union through diplomacy, arms control agreements, mutual recognition of spheres of influence. The hotline established after the missile crisis would have been just the first step in a broader strategy to institutionalize communication and prevent future standoffs. One of the first and most significant fruits of this approach would have been the aggressive pursuit of further arms control treaties. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 was a landmark achievement, but Kennedy saw it as a beginning, not an end. A re-elected Kennedy would have had the mandate and the motivation to push for more comprehensive agreements, potentially laying the groundwork for the strategic arms limitation talks years before they actually occurred in our timeline. In the summer of 1963, John F. Kennedy had finally begun to commit the moral authority of his office to the cause of civil rights, declaring it a moral crisis. However, his approach was still cautious, balancing the demands of justice against the political risks of alienating the powerful Southern Democratic bloc in Congress. The assassination attempt would have been a transformative event in this regard. Surviving an act of violent extremism would have given Kennedy a visceral understanding of the hatred that fueled the opposition to civil rights. It would have likely burned away his remaining political caution, replacing it with a steely resolve to push for comprehensive change, Meaningful change not as a matter of political calculation, but as a fundamental moral duty. Armed with a new sense of urgency and a reservoir of public goodwill, a recovering Kennedy would have thrown his full weight behind the Civil Rights Bill languishing in Congress in late 1963. In our timeline, it was Lyndon Johnson who masterfully used the nation's grief and his own legislative genius to force the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. In this alternate history, Kennedy himself would lead the charge. His televised addresses on the subject would carry an unprecedented weight, as a president who had been a victim of violence pleaded with the nation to end the violence of segregation. He could have framed the legislation as a necessary step to heal a wounded nation, linking his personal recovery to the nation's need for moral and social reconciliation. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under Kennedy's leadership would have been a monumental victory. In the annals of American domestic policy, the Great Society stands as a towering achievement. Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and a host of other programs aimed at eradicating poverty and racial injustice. Its architect was Lyndon B. Johnson. He leveraged his unparalleled knowledge of Congress and the political moment following Kennedy's death to enact the most significant expansion of the American welfare state since the New Deal. If Kennedy had survived, this ambitious domestic agenda would have taken a different shape. Kennedy shared many of the same goals as Johnson, but his style was different, less transactional, more inspirational. His relationship with Congress was far less masterful than LBJ's. A second-term Kennedy administration would have pursued major domestic reforms, a tax cut to stimulate the economy, federal aid to education, healthcare for the elderly. These were items on his New Frontier agenda. However, the legislative process would have been slower, more piecemeal, perhaps less sweeping. Kennedy would have had to negotiate and compromise with a Congress not shocked into compliance by a national tragedy. He would have relied on his public charisma and the power of the bully pulpit. The culture of the 1960s was a maelstrom of change, a vibrant and often chaotic mix of rock and roll, psychedelic art, political protest. Much of this cultural energy was fueled by two powerful engines: the righteous anger of the civil rights movement, the widespread opposition to the Vietnam War. In an alternate history where Kennedy survives and the U.S. avoids a massive ground war in Asia, the cultural zeitgeist of the decade would be fundamentally altered. The counterculture would still emerge. The seeds of it were already planted in the Beat generation, the burgeoning folk music scene, but its tone and focus would likely be different. It would be a revolution driven less by anti-war fury and more by social and artistic experimentation. Without the daily images of jungle warfare and body bags on the evening news, the deep cynicism toward government that characterized the late 1960s would be less pervasive. The credibility gap that opened up under President Johnson might never have appeared. A surviving Kennedy, especially one who had successfully navigated the nation away from war and toward greater civil rights, would have retained a level of public trust and admiration that was lost in our timeline. This doesn't mean protest would disappear. The civil rights movement would continue its struggle. To imagine a world where John F. Kennedy survived is to contemplate the profound power of contingency in human affairs. It is to recognize that history is not a predetermined path, but a series of choices and chances, where a single moment can redirect the flow of an entire era. The survival of one man in Dallas on November 22, 1963, acts as a master domino, tipping over a chain of events that reshapes the America of the 1960s. The portrait that emerges is of a nation that is still turbulent and transformative, but one that navigates the decade's challenges with a different compass, guided by a leader who was himself transformed by a brush with death. The most significant divergence lies in the jungles of Vietnam. By steering the nation away from a large-scale ground war, a surviving Kennedy would have spared the country its most divisive and traumatic conflict of the 20th century. This single decision would have had cascading benefits: a more stable and less polarized society, a lower national debt, a foreign policy free to focus on the larger strategic challenge of managing the Cold War. The move toward détente with the Soviet Union could have begun earlier and with greater purpose, potentially making the world a safer place. At home, the moral force of a president who had faced down violence could have accelerated the progress of civil rights, lending crucial support to the fight for justice and equality. This is not to say that a second Kennedy term would have been a utopia. The forces of history are too powerful for any one leader to control completely. It is a poignant vision of what might have been, a testament to the enduring idea that in the great sweep of history, a single life can indeed make all the difference.